Hello everyone, welcome to the review series of Intel Focus. You might be surprised, okay, why we started the review series. Well, the review series was there, but it was AI generated, and now we're moving and shifting from AI generated podcasting to more human interaction. Though it was good, but at the same time we want to have more human-based analysis on the topics of our choosing, especially for today's topic. But before that, I would like to introduce my co-host, Rajab Taieb, who's joining me, and he will talk a bit about himself. Rajab, tell us
Thank you, Chris.
and tell others who you are and why you joined the Intel Focus as co-host.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris. It's nice to be with you and to talk about current issues that we have in our region and in the broader region. Yeah, uh, I am involved in the Central Asian affairs. I do research on Central Asian topics related to Central Asia, mainly on Afghanistan. And yeah, I do research on gender issues, but also more importantly on security and political developments in Afghanistan and in the broader region. And I'm happy to be here with you and to talk about our today's topic.
Great. Yes, I'm really looking forward to discussing one of the interesting topics that I think it's foreshadowed by so many other news and its connection to Afghanistan and Syria finally. So today's focus is on a group that once actually grabbed the attention of the whole global security analysts, jihadist propaganda monitors, and also the Chinese state media alike. And that group is called the Turkestan Islamic Party, or TIP. They were previously called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, but then they shifted to the Turkestan Islamic Party. And we're going to break down that and how they started it and who they are and where they actually finally disbanded, which recently we saw this news from Syria coming up that the TIP, who were fighting with Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham against Syrian forces, they officially disbanded and became part of the new Syrian army. But I think, Rajab, it's good for our audience to understand who East Turkestan Islamic Movement was and and why they're in Syria. Do you think our audience would benefit from an introduction to the Islamic Turkestan Party?
Yes, of course,
Yeah,
because these groups and these movements, they pop up in different regions and they
yeah,
move along different regions, and it's helpful that give an introduction and to
yeah.
explain how they finally end up in Syria and what they are doing there.
Yeah, exactly. So the TIP, I'm sure a lot of people have seen the abbreviation. They were originally known as the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. It is a militant group actually made up of Uyghurs, and the reason this movement came to being was because of the repression and statelessness they felt and experienced in the Uyghur region of China, which is called Xinjiang and located in Western China, and it borders also Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and other Central Asian countries. It was actually founded in the late 90s and allegedly formalized around 1997 by Hassan Mahsum. Hassan Mahsum was the leader of this group back then. It was mostly mixed up of ethno-religious goals. So it wasn't just an ethnic group wanted an independent state for themselves, but it was also mostly um, also a jihadist movement, sort of Islamic movement that they wanted to have. So the creation of independent East Turkestan was the main goal. They wanted to separate completely from China and establish the East Turkestan movement. And ethnically, they're Turkic. They're different from other Chinese people. But it soon found fertile ground in the post-Soviet chaos of Afghanistan, and then Pakistan because of the war, the civil war in Afghanistan, and then later the Taliban. They found themselves very safe in a place that they could thrive, basically. And then they formed and established links with Al Qaeda as well. And interestingly, after the US intervention in Afghanistan and when the Taliban's first regime fell, of course, a lot of Taliban members, they went to Pakistan, right? And in the tribal
Yes.
areas. And among them was also the leader of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. But he was killed in 2003. by Pakistani forces. But the leadership actually passed to another person who was called Abdul Haq al-Turkestani, and he actually aligned the group more closely with global jihadist objectives like Al-Qaeda or other movements. And it was around 2008 that they actually became very famous globally because they launched a propaganda wing where they published, of course, propaganda, but also threats against the Chinese state. And they said they will attack China and also the West. And particularly, it was around the Beijing Olympics, which
Yeah.
they threatened Chinese state. That's when it got a global attention to it. And then it was later labeled by by US, I guess, as well as United Nations, which is very important. They were labeled as a terrorist group. So they also found it very hard to carry their objectives. And I think that's one of the reasons also when China started these concentration camps in Uyghur places in Xinjiang, right, Rajab?
Yes, 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 of course.
Yeah,
Yes, as you described, it seems like the Uyghur groups, they, in the first place, they might not have been, or they might not have had this jihadist idea
yeah,
to have an influence into other regions. So they were sort of created in reaction to the repression from the Chinese government. And then when they couldn't find a footprint inside in their region, so then they inevitably went out of their region, out of Xinjiang. And then,
yeah,
yeah, as you mentioned it, the case of Afghanistan is very closely connected with other cases in the region. For example,
yeah.
the 9/11 attacks, then it's bolstered the justification of the Chinese government to repress more the Uyghur community in Xinjiang. So, and then it also made this movement more attractive
Yeah.
for more younger Uyghur youths to join.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point because we've seen a lot of reports by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, and also international watchdogs calling out China for their repression of Uyghurs. But I think there is this other element into it that I think a lot of people actually miss and don't pay attention to it. And the reason was one of the reason was because of these separatist movements that ignited this whole chaos and tension between the Chinese state and the Xinjiang region of China, that they thought, okay, they're being brainwashed and Islamized in a way. That's why they started like basically cultural cleansing them, trying to assimilate them more into the broader Chinese ideology, communist agenda, and also trying to remove their unique language as well and force them to adopt the Mandarin as their also like a local language in communications. Yeah, interestingly, they found foothold in Syria later. It was around 2010 to 12 when the Syrian civil war started, right? And then TIP fighters actually moved in with their families to Idlib, where they also aligned with two different groups mainly. One was Jabhat al-Nusra, and then later it was Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, which is interestingly, the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Ahmad Sharra, he's now the president or the leader of the new Syria. But yeah, I mean, now we see these news coming out that they actually disbanded the whole group and joined the Syrian army. What do you think? Why is that? What came? Why they started a separatist movement and their goal was to create an East Turkestan, a state, a complete different state, and now they completely disbanded and assimilated into a new country, a new army. And why is that? What do you think?
I think based on what we see on media and what we read, the East Turkestan movement or these foreign fighters in Syria, they know their capabilities and they know the power of the Chinese government, which has consolidated over the entire territory, and that was basically the main factor that drove them out of that region because of these international elements in Syrian conflict, which sort of enabled many foreign fighters and groups to go to Syria and to join one of the warring parties. So now that they are there and they are returned to their initial region and pursuing their initial goal seems impossible to them because of the Chinese governments and its ability in using technology and surveillance and monitoring people and movements inside China. So they have to remain there, and then they are integrated into Syrian army due to several factors.
Mm,
First, they made up one of the core pillars of the rebellion fighters during the Assad regime.
mm,
So they fought, or the former Syrian forces under the command of Ahmad al-Shari. And then when the Assad regime toppled, then first the US government opposed the integration of these forces into the Syrian army. And they asked the new Syrian leadership to dismiss them all, dissolve them all, and do not integrate them into the national army. And then the new Syrian leadership, they proposed to the U.S. the integration of these forces into the integration of these foreign fighters into the new Syrian army. And this proposal was motivated by security risks that the leadership is well aware of.
yeah.
And they know that abandoning these foreign fighters and leaving them outside the state apparatus, especially outside the security apparatus, would motivate them to join other militant groups like
Mm,
ISIS or Daesh. And I think they have learned this from the case in Iraq.
right.
As you know, in post 2010, post 2003, when the after the U.S. attacked Iraq and toppled Saddam Hussein government,
Mm-hmm.
then the new provisional authority of Iraq under the auspices of the U.S. government,
Yeah.
they dissolved the entire Syrian army and 400,000 soldiers.
You mean the Iraqi army?
Yes, the Iraqi army. 400,000 trained soldiers and officers, they lost their jobs overnight.
Mm,
So in the morning, they didn't have anything to do, and they didn't have any income.
right.
So they become dissatisfied with the new authority, with the U.S. invasion of
Mm,
Iraq, and then they were drawn into new militias that were formed in Iraq and later in Syria,
mm,
into new militant groups, especially Daesh and ISIS. And some of these fighters, they came together, they also established their own militias. So this was one of the biggest military failure from the US part in Iraq. And they did these big mistakes, and there was no way to go back and to solve it. So
right.
now Ahmad al-Shah, he knows very well from the Iraqi case, and his administration knows that abandoning foreign fighters, especially when they have nowhere to go and their skills are mostly fighting, and this abandoning them and leaving them out of the security forces
Yeah.
would draw them to other militant groups, especially when, in this case, in the case of foreign fighters in Syria,
Mm-hmm.
they have a past, they have a history of working, of fighting with or against other militant groups like Daesh and ISIS.
Right.
So they can easily re-establish those connections because they sort of share ideology or
Mm.
part of the ideology and sentiments with those groups, and it's very easy for them to return to those groups and to join them back. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's very important to also note that there are two things. One is that a lot of these fighters actually moved with their families to Syria, so they've been residing there. And then the second was that they showed loyalty, right? Loyalty to the Syrian leadership, and they were good fighters. They were fighters. I think I read somewhere that they were also part of this suicide squad, something like that, of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, where they would just fight until they die. So that made them very courageous in a way, and that proved their loyalty. But of course, it shows this concern with the Iraq's example that they may join other groups, and there is this vulnerability. And ISIS is still a big threat in Syria because there was a huge suicide attack against the new Syrian army, but it was the SDF, the Kurdish, this US-backed Kurdish fighters in Syria, that ISIS carried out a very strong suicide bombing against them. So that still is there, and they're still scared of not having it. But there is this question, right? If you're integrating these fighters into, let's say, the new Syrian army, even if they're loyal, would that still be a Syrian army? That's the question. Or still is a global jihadist army coming together and controlling a country which they fought against Assad, who was, yes, from Syria and his army was Syrian. But I think if one argues that, and the other side would still argue that, oh, well, even Assad, he had Russian forces on his side and they were fighting, right? So there is this clash of fighting. But at the end of the day, does it really matter or not? That's the question I think we should be thinking about. And for that, I guess I would say, well, in the case of Uyghur fighters, the Turkestan Islamic Party, they have nowhere else to go. That's the thing, right? They can't go back to Afghanistan. They can't go to Pakistan, of course, first thing, and they can't go to Afghanistan. Well, the reason, because Taliban have good relationship with China, and China doesn't want that. Group is actually actively operating against them from its neighbor in Afghanistan. While we cannot also reject the notion that they also have a lot of fighters in Afghanistan, but they have assimilated over time with the Taliban, right? And there were many reports on that as well. But on the other hand, even if they're in Syria, this is a very huge deal for US-China relationship as well, because the US is warming up to the new Syrian leadership, and Trump actually met Ahmad al-Shara in Riyadh, and slowly the sanctions are also removing, and they're being recognized as a new state of Syria internationally. And I read this report that Ahmad al-Shara, who was most wanted and was an Al-Qaeda offshore member, he may attend the UN General Assembly in New York in September. So this is a very huge, dramatic shift from that angle into, being a jihadist, into being a representing country and the soil of a country that actually they were trying to kill you for being a terrorist. I think there will be a huge issue between, among Syria, Turkey, US, and China, because, okay, Turkey backs Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The US is warming up to them and removed Mother Shara from its most wanted list. Of course, the Uyghur fighters being assimilated, they were already removed by the US as a terrorist group. And now still China is being cornered again. Like, China still considers them as terrorists. And where the future of this would be, this is still an unknown case. But I think maybe you can shed some light on that. These fighters, which is around 3,500, would they use the new Syrian army or Syria as just a temporary base or place that they could gather around, come up with new strategies, and possibly for a future militant movement going against them? Or they are just, do you think, they're finished completely? They're disbanded now?
I think it depends on the developments in Syria, that how things will go and how things will unfold in the near future and in the long run. And having foreign fighters into a security apparatus of a government, it is a huge issue, yeah. But again, it depends on the level of their integration into the new army. Not just the integration of the fighters, but also the integration of their families into the Syrian society, that how well they will be integrated and how well they will be welcomed and how well they will be accepted. Those are all factors that will have an impact on the activities and on the performances of these foreign fighters.
Also, I think he also mentioned that they will be granted Syrian citizenship.
Yes, of course. He also mentioned that they will become Syrian citizens, and
Mm,
if they will become Syrian citizens, then there is a chance that the foreign fighters and their families they will be integrated into Syrian army and into Syrian society, and that would limit the level of security threats that these groups might pose to this Syrian society or to the original community in their homeland. But having foreign fighters into a country's armed forces is not also a new phenomenon. We have seen it in many places. There are also cases like a military company, they contract wars, so they fight a wars on behalf of states. There are also like hundreds of non-state actors all over the globe. For example, in Afghanistan, the foreign countries use them as proxy and,
mm,
and, and, and fought their wars through them in the past 40 years of our history. So that's a little different because they are controlled by outside and they are sent by outside powers. But in
mhm.
this case, the chance that these forces to be integrated into the Syrian army and into the Syrian society is much higher because
Yeah.
if they receive the citizenship, then slowly they will become integrated. And
Mm,
also, as we know that the US is easing sanctions on Syria, so in the near future, there is a possibility that there will be good economic developments in Syria.
mm, mm.
So, as you know, the economy or economic situation and militancy, these two are very closely linked.
Right. Yeah.
In a context where poverty is on the rise, same time, same time militancy is on the rise
Mm, mm.
because when people they they face hardships, they cannot make a living, and those who have these fighting skills
Yeah.
and they have this experience, there is a greater chance that they establish militias or they start terrorist activities
Yeah.
or they will coordinate with other militant groups.
Yeah.
But when the economic situation is good and they are integrated, then the likelihood that they will pose threats, it becomes limited.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the reason would be that if there is poverty, of course, you need hope, you need money, right? And militancy provides both because you're getting paid. I don't know how much for every group is different and from in different means. It's not just like proper salary, let's say, but they getting paid in different means. But it also provides them hope, right? Because you're fighting for something, right? You're fighting for something. You say, okay, there's based on jihadist ideology, you see, okay, injustice or there are infidels everywhere, and then you're fighting them, meaning okay, you're establishing something. So that provides, that's why I think if you have good economy and if you bring hope to people, it becomes less of them joining those groups. And it's interesting because the question would be like, is TIP finished? Is a very complex one, right? Right? It may have been finished in Syria, right? But its roots, historical roots in Afghanistan, in Waziristan, in Pakistan, right? In other regions, it hasn't ended. They still operate somehow. Like there are groups. There may be like the Syrian brand of it has disbanded, but of course the whole movement may still have some sort of rebranding in the future. Because this is the thing with a lot of militant movements, right? They may just disband or dissolve quietly, saying you dissolve. That's the same happening in let's say in Pakistan, where one group dissolves and other jihadist group emerges there, and you see that the new emergence might be with a new sort of identity or completely new branded mission. They may focus on something else, and I think from Xinjiang's borders, right, all the way to Syria and now into the ranks of National Army, the TIP is unusual. The case of TIP is very unusual in the global militancy movements, but it's not unprecedented, right? And for China, actually, their threats will still continue, and China will see Syria not as a friend.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yeah, these and similar militant groups they do not disappear overnight because
Yeah, yeah.
they didn't appear overnight. They are part of long-term problems, long-term political and economic issues. So in the first place, they didn't appear in a matter of a year or a month. So they have been the products of decades of dissatisfactions with the state's policies and the economic and political situations. So they will not disappear overnight because they didn't appear overnight. Then, yeah, as you said, when they disappears officially in one region, then they keep their unofficial ties with like-minded people in other
Mm,
regions because they are connected not by land, but they are connected by ideology. And
absolutely.
usually these groups, they officially announce their dissolution in one region because of political issues.
Mm,
For
mm.
example, in Syria now, the U.S. is warming up with the Syrian government and with the new government, and so they are sort of taking care of this foreign fighters issue. But
Absolutely.
the same policy is not, for example, implemented in Afghanistan.
Mm, mm.
There is a different policy by the same superpower.
Yeah,
So this game keeps this movement, these groups alive. So
yeah,
they disappear in one region
yeah,
officially, but they still operate in other regions and they keep their connections.
yeah,
Yeah, and they then persist over time and they continue to operate. But the level of their operation, the level of their organization, it depends on how they play with the game that is initially started
yeah.
and it's administered by big powers.
Mm.
Yeah, so they sort of keep living in conditions that are provided in a larger geopolitical competitions between regional and international powers.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Every jihadist movement, they just don't disappear. Sometimes they just shift into another thing. Um, that was the Intel Focus review series. Thanks for joining. We'll be talking about another topic next time. And thanks, Rajab. That was really good analysis of the Turkestan Islamic Party and how they disbanded. Until next time, take care.
Thank you, Qais.